They were the best. 9 experienced hikers, handpicked for their skill, their endurance, their unshakable calm in the face of nature's fury. On January 28, 1959, they ventured into the northern Ural Mountains with enough supplies to last weeks. But by February 2nd, something happened on that mountain that defied every law of logic, survival, and sanity. None of them should have died that night. The expedition leader was Igor Dyatlov, a 23-year-old engineering student whose previous treks had become legendary among Soviet climbing circles. His team wasn't a group of reckless thrill-seekers. They were university athletes, seasoned outdoorsmen, people who knew how to read weather, how to build shelter in a blizzard, how to survive. They carried maps, compasses, food, warm clothing, cameras. Everything pointed to a routine winter trek across the Ural Ridge toward Oderton Mountain, a peak whose name in the local Mansi language meant, "Don't go there." But they went, and what happened next would haunt investigators for decades. The first week of the journey was uneventful. The group moved through snow-covered forests and frozen rivers with practiced efficiency. They took photographs, smiling faces, campfires, skis propped against trees. In one image, Dyatlov stands with his arms crossed, confident, unbothered by the sub-zero cold. In another, team member Lyudmila Dubinina laughs as she adjusts her backpack. These weren't people afraid of the wilderness. They were in their element. On January 31st, they began their ascent toward the pass. One member, Yuri Yudin, turned back due to illness. He was the only one who would survive. Years later, he would say that parting from the group saved his life, but also cursed him with a lifetime of questions. The remaining 9 pushed forward. They climbed higher, into a region the indigenous Mansi people avoided. Local folklore spoke of spirits in the mountains, of places where the wind carried voices that weren't human. But the hikers were Soviets, trained in materialism and science. Superstition had no place in their world. On the evening of February 1st, they set up camp on the eastern slope of Kholat Syakhl, a mountain whose name translated to Dead Mountain. The wind was picking up. The temperature was dropping fast, well below 25 degrees Celsius. But they had done this before. They pitched their tent, secured it against the wind, and prepared for the night. And then, something went wrong. When the group failed to return by their expected date of February 12th, concern grew slowly at first. Delays were common in winter expeditions, but by February 20th, when there was still no word, search parties were dispatched. What they found on February 26th was impossible to explain. The tent was still standing, but it had been cut open from the inside. Long, deliberate slashes ran through the canvas, as if the occupants had used knives to tear their way out in a frenzy. Footprints led away from the tent down the slope, some barefoot, some in socks, some in a single boot. The tracks suggested the group had fled in panic, without stopping to grab their coats, their shoes, their survival gear. In nice 30-degree Celsius weather, they ran into the night wearing almost nothing. The first 2 bodies were found at the edge of a forest, about a mile from the tent. Yuri Krivonishenko and Yuri Doroshenko were lying near the remains of a fire, dressed only in underwear. Their hands were burned, their skin frozen solid. Branches above them had been snapped up to 5 meters high, as if someone had climbed the tree in desperation. But why? 3 more bodies were discovered along the slope between the tent and the forest. Igor Dyatlov, Zinaida Kolmogorova, and Rustam Slobodin had died trying to return to the tent. Their faces were turned uphill, their bodies frozen mid-crawl. Slobodin had a fractured skull, but investigators noted it wasn't severe enough to kill him immediately. He had kept moving. The remaining 4 took 2 months to find. They were buried under 4 meters of snow in a ravine further into the forest. And this is where the case turned from tragic to terrifying. Lyudmila Dubinina, Alexander Kolovatov, Nikolai Thibault-Brignol, and Alexander Zolotaryov were found in May, after the snow began to melt. Their bodies told a story that investigators couldn't piece together. Dubinina's tongue was missing, not torn, removed. Her eyes were gone. The soft tissue of her face had been stripped away. Thibault-Brignol had massive skull fractures, the kind of blunt force trauma you'd see in a car crash. Zolotaryov and Dubinina both had broken ribs, not from a fall, but from pressure so intense it was compared to a car accident. Yet there were no external wounds, no bruises, no cuts. The force had come from inside. One investigator described it as an unknown compelling force. The medical examiner stated that the chest injuries would require a force equivalent to a car crash, but there were no signs of a struggle, no surrounding damage. It was as if something had crushed them without leaving a mark. Stranger still, some of the clothing recovered from the ravine victims was radioactive. Tests showed beta radiation levels far above normal. The clothes had been cut and shared among the survivors. Dubinina was wearing Krivonyshenko's jacket. Zolotaryov had a piece of Dubinina's sweater wrapped around his leg. They had been stripping clothes from the dead to survive. But what had they been running from? The Soviet authorities launched an investigation immediately. Lead investigator Lev Ivanov was thorough, methodical. He documented the scene, interviewed witnesses, examined the evidence, but the more he uncovered, the less sense it made. There were no signs of an attack by animals, no tracks, no blood, no struggle. The injuries were too precise, too devastating to be explained by a bear or wolf. There were no signs of an avalanche. The tent was intact, the slope undisturbed. Even if an avalanche had occurred, it wouldn't explain why they fled without dressing, or how some sustained injuries while others froze peacefully. There were no signs of infighting. The group had been cooperative, organized. They died trying to help each other. Ivanov noted something else. Reports from nearby weather stations and military personnel described strange lights in the sky on the night of February 1st. Glowing orange spheres, moving silently across the mountains. Some described them as fireballs. Others said they pulsed, hovered, disappeared. One witness, a geologist camping 50 kilometers south, reported seeing a bright flash followed by a loud booming sound around the time the hikers fled their tent. Ivanov wrote in his report that he believed the group had encountered a natural elemental force that they were unable to overcome. But privately, he would later say he suspected something else, something the Soviet government didn't want investigated. In May 1959, the case was closed. The official cause of death, hypothermia, an unknown compelling force. The files were sealed and classified for decades, but the questions remained. Over the years, researchers, investigators, and theorists have proposed dozens of explanations. None of them fit all the facts. Avalanche? The slope wasn't steep enough. The tent was undisturbed, and it doesn't explain the radiation, the missing tongue, or the lights in the sky. Military testing? Some believe the group stumbled into a Soviet weapons test, chemical, biological, or radiological. The radiation on the clothing supports this. But why would the military allow an investigation? Why not simply disappear the bodies? Infrasound. A popular theory suggests that wind passing through the mountains created low-frequency sound waves that induced panic, hallucinations, and irrational behavior. The hikers, driven mad by fear, tore out of their tent and fled into the night. But infrasound doesn't explain the physical injuries or the radioactivity. Paradoxical undressing? In the final stages of hypothermia, victims sometimes feel burning hot and remove their clothing, but the group fled before freezing. They ran nearly a mile in sub-zero temperatures, climbed trees, dug a snow den, shared clothing. They were still fighting to survive. Yeti or unknown predator. Local Mansi legends speak of creatures in the mountains, but there were no tracks, no wounds consistent with claws or teeth, just blunt force trauma and missing soft tissue. UFO or military encounter? The lights in the sky, the radiation, the sudden coordinated flight from the tent. Some believe the hikers witnessed or were targeted by something not of this earth, but there's no direct evidence. In 2019, 60 years after the incident, Russian authorities reopened the investigation. Their conclusion? An avalanche. Despite the evidence to the contrary, despite the decades of unanswered questions, the official Russian government stance is now that a slab avalanche caused the group to panic and flee, leading to their deaths. But investigators who worked the case disagree. Families of the victims reject the explanation. And anyone who looks closely at the photographs, the autopsy reports, the testimonies, knows one thing for certain. Something happened on that mountain that we still don't understand. Among the recovered belongings was a camera belonging to one of the hikers. The film was developed. Most of the photos showed the journey, smiling faces, campfires, snow-covered landscapes, but the last frame was different. It was blurry, overexposed, taken in darkness. Some say it shows nothing, a mistake, a flash in the night. Others claim you can see shapes, lights, figures. The photo has been analyzed, enhanced, debated, but it remains unclear, like everything else about that night. One thing is certain, it was taken after they set up camp. After the sun had set, after they should have been safe inside the tent, something made them pick up the camera. Something made them look outside. Yuri Yudin, the only member who turned back before the tragedy, lived until 2013. He spent his life trying to understand what happened to his friends. He revisited the site. He studied the evidence. He spoke to investigators. In one of his final interviews, he said, "If I had gone with them, I would have died too. But sometimes I think, maybe I would have seen what they saw. Maybe I would finally know." He paused. "But maybe it's better that I don't." Yudin died without answers. The case remains open in the minds of those who refuse to let it rest. 9 experienced hikers entered the Ural Mountains in 1959. None of them came back alive. Their tent was torn open from the inside. Their bodies were found scattered across a frozen forest, some with injuries that defied explanation, some with missing tongues and eyes, some dressed in radioactive clothing. And to this day, no one knows why. What would make 9 experienced hikers abandon their only shelter in the middle of a sub-zero night, tear through their tent with knives, and run barefoot into the wilderness? What force could crush ribs and fracture skulls without leaving external wounds? Why was their clothing radioactive? What were the lights in the sky? And why, after 60 years, does the Russian government still struggle to explain what happened on Dead Mountain? The answer is out there, somewhere in the frozen silence of the Ural Mountains, buried under decades of snow and secrecy. But maybe some doors are meant to stay closed. Maybe some questions should never be answered. Because if we knew what really happened that night, would we ever feel safe in the mountains again?